Happy Easter, everybody. Really amazed and glad to be with you this morning as we're all doing the best we can right now. I want to give a big shout out to all the musicians who helped today bring us some Easter tunes, and all of you who also submitted videos for talking about resurrection, as you just saw. That was really just honestly great to hear people's real authentic thoughts and reflections. It's something that as a community we do well, and that I've missed doing with all of you. When all this shutting down stuff began, before we started to just actually grasp how serious and prolonged the situation would be, one of my first thoughts was, please, Lord, do not make us cancel Easter, which at that point was some 4 weeks off or something like that. Of course, we are not able to gather today, and that's okay. Resurrection has been preached in the most dire of situations, and I see us as just sort of continuing on in that tradition today. We talked last week on Palm Sunday about joy, and it was a message that I felt like we all needed in some way, none more than myself, because this is really difficult. It's certainly important for us to maintain a perspective on our privilege often, right? Like having the ability to just stay home itself is a privilege, to maintain a job for some of us, have families even that we're able to call and FaceTime with, being relatively young and healthy, right? These are privileges that we have, but I think it's troubling and also very unhealthy for us to deny the reality of our anguish in this time as well, right? Like, it's okay. We must also recognize that it's we should be able to say that this sucks, that we have suffered, and that we are suffering. This has personally been for me one of the more difficult weeks over this pandemic time, right? Like, one of my best friends called me this week, and someone that I consider like family, and I heard an edge in this person's voice right when I picked up that I had never quite heard before, right? He was on the verge of mental breakdown, suicidal, just triggered and exacerbated by being in isolation, and it scared the shit out of me, to be honest with you, and it shook me to my core, and it's something I'm still thinking about today. And it wouldn't shock me if all of us have been in touch with something like this somewhere or another, with moments like this, maybe even moments that we've had ourselves. In light of all that, it's no surprise that when reading the Easter narrative this week, I found myself almost singularly and obsessively focused on the image of Mary weeping. I found it, and I find it to be by far the most kind of human element in this story, the most relatable, authentic, raw thing. Because we, frankly, are a species that weeps, that grieves, that mourns, that feels the pain of loss. We are criers, big criers. We come into the world that way, and it continues on throughout the rest of our lives. And Mary's weeping struck me as, again, this sort of part of this most fundamental thing, and the power of those kinds of emotions are deeply embedded in us, in everything from our social behavior, our history, our culture, the way we construct meaning, the very way that we find ourselves navigating this world. You might even say that the very idea of God could be seen as a child that's born out of our weeping. We've all been reading a lot of things in the news for sure, and a few corona-related stories I would say have attached themselves to my psyche, like the ones about people dying alone, right? Their partners, families, unable to see them or care for them. There are mass graves happening right now. Funerals and common burials are just not happening or being denied, right? These rituals that are so important to how we work out our grief in the face of unspeakable things. It seems to me that something like that brought Mary to the tomb early that Easter day, before the sun had even come out, which is a time that I personally only see if I stay up through the night, and I imagine that Mary perhaps couldn't sleep as well. The gospel story tells us that after Jesus died, his body was taken by two men, Joseph and Nicodemus, who laid it in the tomb. And the Lucan Easter story, right, from the Gospel of Luke, mentions that a group of women, Mary among them, go to the tomb with spices and ointments to prepare Christ's body for its final rest. Mary, who had followed Jesus throughout most of his ministry, and had, the story tells us, just witnessed the crucifixion close up a couple days before. She just wants to be able to say goodbye, to do her grieving, to perform, again, these rituals that we do to properly honor the people that we've lost and loved. So of course, it's not surprising, right? She reacts this way when she finds the empty tomb, fearing the most rational and terrible of possibilities. The idea that Jesus would just walk out of this thing on his own accord doesn't even enter her mind, right? The body must have been taken. She goes and tells the disciples, these dudes who I hate on these dudes a lot, they're just so very roastable. They run to see the tomb, but when they see it's empty, they just go home, which I find very strange. Maybe they were scared of running into Roman guards or something like that, which also makes them cowards, I would say. But Mary, she stays, right? She is too overcome by her pain to be scared. She has to know what happened. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, the text tells us. And so, through a prism of her grief, she looks, and suddenly there are these two angels that were not there before, right? They hadn't shown up for Peter, the one Jesus would ask to lead the remaining disciples later, or even for John, the disciple that's often described as the one Jesus loved. They didn't show up for them. They showed up now, though, for the one who stayed and wept. Mary turns and a new person is standing before her. We all know what it's like to have heavy tears and swollen eyes obscure our vision. She doesn't recognize this person, right, until the risen Christ says her name. And that's a sound so unmistakable to her, one that reaches deep into her soul, a voice more trustworthy than her own eyes. I think there's nothing quite like being called by name by someone who really knows you. It's more than a name, it's an identity, it's an acknowledgement of all you are as a person. And for Mary, in that morning, it was the unmistakable sound of resurrection. The unmistakable sound of a risen God who showed up for the one who stayed and wept. Easter, especially here at Root and Branch, often pushes us to consider the outer limits of what we know, what we think is true. It pushes us to the outer reaches of what we can accept sometimes with all this religion stuff, right? Into the strange, the weird, the metaphysical, the miraculous. And that experience or thinking about that stuff can be alienating, maybe even feels a little embarrassing. I've certainly felt that in my life, but there is something so deeply human here in this story that I hadn't quite seen before that makes all of those strange things feel a little bit less so. According to this particular testimony, it is the one who is in touch with her most fundamental humanness, who is able to see the unthinkable, the unimaginable. It's the one who sees through her pain, sadness, and suffering, not through in the sense of looking past, but through like with a lens. It's that person who the risen Christ is revealed to. If we look at this whole Easter thing as not just this unfathomable tale of zombie-like reanimation, but as a story about how, in the famous words of the psalmist, God turns mourning into dancing and clothes us in joy. If we see it that way, I think we might find the distance between ourselves and the inscrutable event of resurrection just shrinking a little bit. If we believe that the first witness of Easter was not just randomly chosen by chance, but was met in a moment for a reason, we might see an invitation to draw actually closer to ourselves, to our breath, our bodies, our tears, our grief, drawing close to the very place where a murdered God finds new breath. It's sort of funny, weird to consider that for most of the church's history, the massive point of contention and argument was not actually the impossibility of resurrection, but the scandal of a God made flesh, a God living in these gross and disgusting bodies we walk around in. I don't actually think our bodies are gross and disgusting, though I haven't worked out at all for months, so I feel a little bit like that maybe, but a God who would still show up in these bodies, right? A God that could be tortured, could be crucified. How unfathomable and weird and strange was that for them? It stretched them to the outer limits of what they thought about all this religious stuff. And as much as it might seem that modernity has flipped this dynamic, right? It's actually worth considering whether or not that's true. Maybe we have just as hard of a time believing in this stuff as they did. Believing that the source of all our being, love itself, would care so much about our pain that God would show up like this, for this, reminding us that we ought not run away from this body, but actually towards it. The foreign place that religion occupies in our culture, I think, obscures the truth that just about all of the Bible is consistently and eminently concerned with a God who has a deep relationship with creation. The sacred text doesn't make God the central character where everything else in the world is just like a sort of bit player on God's journey to self-discovery, like a sitcom or whatever. Some might argue that that's actually true, but I would very much disagree, because such a story I don't think would be called good news. The gospel accounts in particular are very much about a relationship between flesh and blood, with historical context where politics, wars, empires, economies, diseases shape the very message of God. It's a story that sets itself among the most ordinary of characters, right? Common folks, soldiers, tax collectors, government employees, sons, daughters, Peter the fisherman, and of course, our figure Mary. The context of the Easter story, as much as the Easter story itself, shows us a God who is close by, close enough to be human as well, close enough to know what that means. If that's true, then we are looking, I think, in the wrong place if we scan far off and unseen horizons for evidence of resurrection, or listen into the far reaches of space to try and hear a name from above. Mary, the first witness, an unlikely witness by all normal standards, does not search for Jesus that way. It doesn't even occur to her to try. She encounters resurrection when she is true and present to her suffering, her humanity. That's where she finds God. That's where God shows up. As I thought about this, another verse etched somewhere deep in the crevices of my mind rose to the surface. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. You might have heard this before. It's one of the Beatitudes, part of some of the most famous words ever attributed to Jesus. Many of the Beatitudes are actually kind of perplexing. They don't make a lot of sense, but this one is supposed to be, supposedly, one of the more straightforward ones and simple ones to understand. But I have to confess that I never really quite got it now, I think. Really quite got it, I think, until now, until I saw it through the lens of resurrection. As you saw in our video, I asked all of us to answer this question: what does resurrection mean to you? Unsurprisingly, we did not get a flood of responses, which makes sense. The question was intentionally not something easy, like what's your favorite Easter tradition or whatever. It was supposed to be something difficult, something that required some wrestling. So I know it was difficult, and to be fair to you, I will answer this question as well in light of all that I've been saying. I fundamentally believe in the promise that nothing can separate us from love, from God. In the darkest times, in real pain, in real suffering, that belief may become dim to the point of almost being rejected, but it still remains like a pilot light somewhere in me ready to burn bright. And resurrection is just that promise fulfilled. Right? The promise that God breathes again, and so will I. When I realized that we definitely would not be able to gather in person this Easter, I found myself wishing somewhat stupidly, I don't know, so I'm wishing at least that we could postpone it somehow. But as I mentioned in the beginning, this promise is something that's been preached throughout history, through wars, plagues, famines, through the collapse of countries, cities, families, through every personal tragedy one could endure. It's been preached through all of it, all the time. And we are here today, I think, to hear that promise anew, just as generations of weeping people have gathered in the past to do so as well. You can't stop Easter in some ways. And blessed are those who mourn, for they are the ones who will be comforted. Mary found the truth of what that meant to her on Easter Sunday. And it's my prayer and my hope that all of us may be able to find the truth of that today as well. Amen. I want to invite you now to go back to the Zoom chat where we'll have a time of prayer and communion. I invite you also at this point, if you haven't already, to grab some communion elements for yourself, some bread type thing or whatever you have, some juice, some wine, or some drink as well. We'll see you there.